Thanks, Ellie. Oops.
Morning, Jason. Morning, Jason. Yeah, that's not bad. Oops. Yeah, just yeah. I'll be a few minutes. Okay.
Yeah. So if I
You do half an hour.
finish about sort of 20 past and time for questions, sort of thing, is that right? Okay, I'll aim for that. Can't promise that.
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Welcome, colleagues. Please come in and fill the spaces towards the centre. That would be marvellous. Thank you. Morning. Colleagues, welcome back to our TIRI conference, and a big welcome to our partner colleagues who have joined us today. Everything in this room has been live streamed, unless a presenter says that they would not like to be live streamed. The programme is in your packs, and page 5 is the overview. So I know most of you are here tomorrow, so I'll just quickly go through a few things for colleagues who have just joined us today. So I'm doing the welcome, and then we have our first keynote, followed by our interactive workshops, lunch at 12 o'clock in the SLZ, and then back here for 1 o'clock, please, colleagues, for a keynote address. And then we have a presentation from the SU, afternoon refreshments in the atrium where you had refreshments this morning, and then academic papers, flash presentations and interactive workshops running parallel. Colleagues that booked into interactive workshops, you have your first choices. And of course you don't have to book into the flash presentations and the academic papers. there's no room capacity issue there because they're in lecture theatres. So please go to those as well. A little bit of housekeeping, colleagues. There's no fire drill planned. If you need anything at all, please ask, especially our partner colleagues. If you don't know your way around, just ask one of our friendly Bolton staff and other partner colleagues who know the building. There's a resources box on the table over there for presenters. And have a wonderful day. Just relax and enjoy yourself. And I'm going to pass you over to my colleague, Dr. Yanis Matsoukas, who's going to tell you a little about Twitter and also to introduce our first keynote speaker. Thank you, colleagues.
Good morning. I'm sure that you're familiar about the Twitter competition that we have online. For participants that they don't have access on Wi-Fi, we set up a free Wi-Fi. It's called TIRI 2017, and the password is TIRIConf. Okay, so please join us online. There's a small present for the account with the most significant contribution online. Okay. Now, great privilege for me to introduce the first keynote speaker, okay, Dr. Stian Riemers. Dr. Riemers completed his first degree in natural sciences and his PhD in experimental psychology at Cambridge University. He holds other degrees from Imperial College and Birkbeck. He's currently a senior lecturer at City, University of London. Prior to joining City, he held postdoctoral positions at University of Warwick and UCL. Now, his main interests lie in the area of high-level cognition, in particular judgment and decision-making. So if you're going online, you'll find many contributions on BBC programs and other media companies. I really enjoyed the pub interview, okay, the Philosopher's Arms. So apart from this, he has a special interest in exploitation of technology in experimental psychology research and teaching. So his web app called Quaddle was recently runner-up for the Teaching Excellence category in the Guardian Teaching Awards. So without further ado, please welcome at the University of Bolton at TIRI conference, Dr. Stian Riemers.
Well, good morning. It's very nice to be here, and really exciting to see the variety and sort of innovativeness of some of the other projects that are going on here. I've just been sort of flicking through the abstracts, and I think some of the ideas that I've been sort of having with the projects that I've been working on overlap quite substantially with some of the things going on here. So that's really exciting to see. Thank you very much for that very kind and warm introduction. I will be talking about the project that I've been working on recently, which is to try and improve the lecture, to try and sort of find ways of dealing with some of the deficits that we get in sort of traditional large group lectures. The kind of thing I'm doing now and probably shouldn't be. I should be probably doing showing as well as telling and doing something more interactive. But I'm afraid that's what we're stuck with. So what I want to do is I'm going to tell you a bit about the project that I've been leading at City to use technology to try and introduce some interactivity in the lecture. But what I want to do is to set a more sort of wider backdrop, which I think touches on some of the ideas discussed in other keynotes about the kind of having to do more with less, the sometimes feeling that we are pressured and under-resourced to do what we need to do. And what we can do about that, because that's something that we see completely across the sector, across higher education now, for various complex reasons, but in part to do with funding methods and amounts. Academic staff are being asked to do more with less. So we're asked to teach larger groups. We're sometimes given less admin support. We have increased teaching loads. and sometimes we have other responsibilities. At the same time, we have the TEF, and both City and Bolton came out with silvers, which is good to see. But we're having this increased pressure to not just teach well and not just support our students, but to demonstrate it as well. And we need to keep satisfaction high. We need to keep progression levels high, and we want the best possible outcomes for our students. And that leads to a bit of a problem, because we're doing more, we're having fewer resources, and yet we're trying to get the best possible outcomes. So how do we do this? Something kind of has to give. And there are lots of ways in which different institutions, different departments and different individuals deal with this. So you try and improve efficiency, you try and streamline things, you try not to over-assess people, you try to kind of make the most of the face-to-face time you have with your students. So we've seen examples of flipping classrooms in order to maximize the efficiency and the usefulness and the satisfaction derived from that sort of one-to-one or at least face-to-face teaching. We try and come up with these new ways of teaching. Less positively, there's a motivation to relax standards somehow, to say, well, this will do, rather than this is the best we can possibly do, or to squeeze more out of lecturers, to say, well, you can actually do more. There is this sort of potential. Now, one of the consequences of this sort of high-level environment, which I guess is a fairly general one, I think it's one that we at least recognise, even if we don't experience it ourselves, is that there's limited time or inclination to completely overhaul our teaching, to completely redesign our teaching programs. If we were starting from scratch and deciding, right, we're going to do a whole new program, and we're going to not think about the resourcing it needs, we're just going to think about how we can do it best. I think most of us would do something slightly different from what we do. There's a big incentive to stick with the status quo. The other thing is we can't necessarily do what we absolutely want to do, because we just don't have the resources to do it. So, we might want to do a sort of one-to-one sort of Oxbridge-style supervision sort of system. That would be great, but we just don't have those sorts of resources. So, for at least those two reasons, certainly at City and at other universities I've worked at, the large lecture is the dominant teaching method. It's what's been traditionally used, so it's what carries on by default, and it's scalable. It's as easy to teach 10 people as it is to teach 200 people. And that's all very well. And, and I actually quite like lectures. I can see that they have sort of positive aspects. But there are holes if you're using lectures. And this is what my whole project's been about trying to fill. So, less interaction in a lecture means that students are less motivated. It's very easy, particularly when students have their own devices with them, for students to sort of zone out on the sort of lecturer droning at this sort of monotone, and get on social media and do whatever they want. We know that students learn less well passively than actively, and I'll show a small amount of research about that. I'm sorry, I'm a psychologist, so I'm an empiricist, so I need studies to back up anything I say, so I'll bore you with some of that in a minute. But yes, it seems really clear now. The evidence is only sort of solidified in the past 5 years, maybe, that yes, students learn less well in passive lectures than using active learning techniques. We all sort of knew that a long time ago, but now we can actually support it with evidence. Students get less feedback if they're sitting there passively. They've got no idea whether everyone else is following along and understanding everything, and they're just sort of sitting there not really getting it. Or whether everyone, think, well, everyone must be struggling in the same way that I am. And sometimes it comes as a real shock, kind of 6 or 8 months into their education, undergraduate education, particularly when they're from non-traditional backgrounds, so don't necessarily have tailored expectations to what university is going to, what's required of university, and the sort of self-motivation required. Several months down the line, they find out that they're way below their peers, and they're then struggling to catch up for the rest of the year to try and get through. So, if you're sitting in a lecture, you've got no idea how well other people are learning, how well you compare. And then, on the flip side, the academic staff don't know their students as well. You know, if you're looking at a sea of faces, you don't have that sense of, well, this is someone who we might want to talk to a bit, you know, might want to give some support to because they're struggling or they're, you know, that some of the concepts are not making sense for them. So we find it harder to identify the students for whom we want to sort of target support, you know, both for their own well-being and to make sure they have the maximum chance of making it through the course, the program that we offer. So, given we have the lecture, why don't we just go along with it? You know, why don't we just say, well, it's, you know, it's kind of good enough. This slide, I think, crystallizes it for me. So this is a PNAS paper from 2014 that directly compared passive lectures and active learning. So it was a meta-analysis looking at all studies that had both a condition where people learned actively, and this active learning could have been quizzes, it could have been interactive activities, it could have been group work, you know, anything that is not just sort of passively receiving information from the lecturer. Comparing that with a control condition where people just learn passively. And you can see on those two figures there, the blue bars show an improvement, so this is a change, a reduction in the failure rate. And you can see across all of these studies, the vast majority that had an active component showed a lower failure rate, an improvement in the failure rate with active learning. Similarly, if you like these sort of kernel density functions or whatever, you can see on the right-hand panel that the shift of the average proportion of students who failed reduced from about a third to under a quarter with active learning. So this has pretty big implications that, you know, if we're just doing passive learning, that has implications for progression, because of course, if you fail a course, you know, you're then playing catch up and you're then struggling, you're then having to do retakes at the same time as learning new material, and it just gets harder and harder to make it through. And of course, you know, NSS scores are impacted. Students don't like failing, particularly if they think that it wasn't really their fault. And of course, you know, in terms of workload as well, because, you know, if students have to retake a course or retake assessments, that's obviously an increase in workload. So then you might think the exact opposite. So why do we have lectures at all? Well, I've sort of hinted at the idea, but this again, you know, provides some evidence, and this is among a survey of economists. So lecturers who teach the sort of Economics 101 course, the principles of economics at undergraduate level, looking at 275 different instructors to find out what people did and what they thought of it. And you can see here that, you know, 70% of the class time overall was in large group lectures, with, you know, with just 30% doing other things, or 30% of the time in other things. The perception of the lecture sort of varied a bit. So a third of the lecturers thought that students learned best from lecturers, you know, from lectures, that, you know, the lecture was actually the best thing. As a psychologist, you might see a bit of cognitive dissonance sort of in there. If you're giving lectures, you kind of want to think they're the best thing to do. This may only apply to economics lecturers, but about a third of people, or 30%, said that students don't learn best from the lecture, but it's cheap. You know, it's cost effective. You can teach a lot of people fairly cost effectively. And then about 40% of people were sort of acknowledging that, well, the lecture isn't the best, and we're trying to find alternatives. Although, given the amount of time spent in lectures, it hasn't been completely successful yet. And then there's other research about, you know, kind of more broadly why lecturers don't embrace sort of technological and other sort of curriculum change. Some of it's a lack of motivation, some of it's a lack of imagination to think how it might be done. Some of it's sort of being fairly happy with the status quo, saying, well, it ain't broke, so, you know, don't fix it. Some of it is just not knowing how to do it, and some of it is, and I'm sure we've all encountered this, sort of the uncooperative personality, just that, well, you know, why should I do what these other people are telling me to do, you know? The sorts of things that I've experienced directly are things about credibility as well, that, you know, does this thing work? You know, you want me to use this new, you know, technique, this new approach, this new technology, but does it work? You know, does it actually make students learn better? Or does it just make them happier? Is it enough that they're just happier, even if they're not learning anymore? Or do we need to go further than that? So there's also the issue of time and incentives. And I think, you know, no matter what kind of institution that you're in, there are other things vying for your time. It's either research, other teaching, admin roles, that kind of thing. So Certainly at universities I've worked at, good research is what gets you promoted. So why would you want to devote time into teaching, which doesn't really get you anywhere? Alternatively, it may just be that there is no time at all. That you just don't have the time to develop innovative teaching methods because of the other commitments. So all of this backdrop is just to say, we're stuck with a lecture for a while, for better or worse. Now, more in some topics than others, but across institutions, the lecture's been around since ancient Greek times. I don't think it's going to disappear in the next 10 years, even if we are starting to identify its inadequacies. So we need to work with what we've got, at least some of the time. We can try and change it and try and encourage people to move on to other ways of teaching, but we need to work with what we've got. So if we're going to do that, we need to address downsides relating to attendance and motivation, learning outcomes and progression, student satisfaction and feedback. They're the four main areas, whilst not creating a massive extra load on lecturers who are already hard-pressed to sort of cope with the loads that they currently got. Which is where my project comes in. So what I'll do, I'll give you a very quick overview of Quaddle, which is what we called it. We're continuing a proud tradition of having meaningless names in educational technology. And hopefully what I'll do is I'll sort of introduce this and then give you some of the, my aim is to take the research on the psychology of both learning and motivation to look at how students learn best and how we can use things like gamification to keep them motivated. But I'll give you a quick overview of it first and then explain why I did it how I did. So it's a commercially developed or professionally developed web quiz app. So this is used in large lectures, run in real time, so the lecturer sort of presents the quiz on the screen, advances the questions at appropriate times, and the students see the questions and the options appear on their smartphone, their tablet, or their laptop in real time, and they have to answer before the lecturer moves on. So the lecturer controls the speed at which it progresses. Now, there are various sort of quizzing technologies. This isn't unique, but what it does do uniquely is it uses this sort of gamification idea. So students receive a score, which is fairly standard, but they also receive medals, so you get a gold medal if you get over a certain percentage as determined by the lecturer, silver or bronze. And students can compare their performance on a leaderboard. So at the end of it, they sign up with a nickname that they're happy to be revealed publicly, so they don't get humiliated if they put their real name and find themselves at the bottom of the leaderboard, although we try not to scroll down too far when we show the leaderboard at the end, so no one feels too disappointed. They can compare their performance, so they get this sort of social comparison, which lets them immediately see how well they're doing. And then they can go back over the quizzes they can log in anytime in the future, go back over the quizzes, look at what they answered, look at what the correct answer was, and that can be helpful for their revision. Then they also get automated, personalized, written feedback saying, you're doing really well, you're in the top 10%, you're doing pretty well, that kind of thing. And that's, you might want to focus a bit more. It identifies the areas where they're doing particularly well, saying you were really great on the quiz about, kind of cellular biology, but did less well on the physiology sort of one. So it sort of helps target revision strategies. So this is what it looks like to the student. They play along in real time in the lecture. They then see how well they did. They can read the feedback, which you probably can't, given it's very small on the screen, but it's just saying how well you're doing, how well you compare to other people, and how you compare to other people in terms of participation. Are you turning up and joining in as much as other people? You can then review the questions and you can compare your performance on the leaderboard, both in the overall score that you've got across all of these quizzes. And this is the crucial thing that a lot of quizzing technologies don't do. They don't allow you to track your performance from week to week. So I use this in weekly lectures. So, kind of from the second week of term up until the 10th week, we have a weekly quiz. Students, it gives students a sense of journey, that they want to improve on how they did last week. They want to beat the person who's, kind of one above them. And they want the prizes at the end, which are generally large chocolate things, but slightly disappointing overall. So I want to sort of very briefly go over some of the psychology of learning that has sort of motivated this, because I am a psychologist. I do research. My PhD was on memory, although I work in judgment decision making now and ideas about nudging. So I'm interested in both motivation and learning. So this project, as you can probably see, has the hallmarks of both. There's a lovely review article in Psychological Science and the Public Interest, 2013, done Losky et al., which I strongly recommend for anyone interested in teaching, because it basically evaluates research on 10 techniques that are commonly used to try and learn. So to try and kind of get information into one's head that one can retrieve later, either in exams or in the real world. And they looked at how good each of these techniques were, and a lot of these are familiar. Anyone who interacts with students kind of knows, sees highlighting and underlining of text as they sort of review it, rereading it, summarizing, so getting a lecture notes or a chapter of a textbook and trying to summarize the key materials, explaining to oneself, all that kind of thing. These are the 10 techniques about which research has been done. 2 of them came out as being both effective and generalizable. So they worked, and they worked really well, so the utility was really high. They actually greatly enhanced the amount that students retained relative to control. And they worked in lots of different contexts. It wasn't just about, well, if you're learning facts, if you're trying to remember historical dates or names of proteins or something, you can do it. But if you're trying to learn concepts, it doesn't work. This worked more generalizably across lots of different domains. So practice testing is the idea that you, rather than just recognize stuff again, so if you reread things, you're basically recognizing what you've already learnt. Practice testing is you actually have to retrieve it. So you close the textbook, you answer questions on it, you quiz yourself, you try and retrieve it. And we know from the psychology of learning and memory that if you have to retrieve something once, it's easier to retrieve in the future, whether in an exam or in day-to-day practice. So if you're learning, if you're doing a nursing course or ophthalmology or something where you have a certain set of information or concepts that you need to be able to retrieve, this works very well. The second one is distributed practice. So rather than revising for a long time in one go, you try and distribute it. So you learn something. You then, rather than say spending an hour trying to learn this one thing, spend 10 minutes on it now, and then in a day's time, spend another 10 minutes, a week's time, another 10 minutes, a month's time, another 10 minutes. So you study for an hour overall, but you recall a lot more if you distribute your practice over time rather than do it in a block. And so quizzes obviously do this. They do both of these. They force you to retrieve information at the same time as spacing it over time, or at least you've got the option of spacing over time. So the way I tend to use Quaddle is I have it running. I basically slot it into the lecture where I would normally recap what we did last week. I'll just run a quiz on what we did last week so that students are forced to recall the material from a week ago, and at least that's one more learning episode to distribute it over time. The other advantage of quizzing, of course, is that students get feedback and lecturers get feedback. So lecturers get to identify which bits of the course people didn't understand, and students get to work out which bits of the course they probably need to spend more time looking at. And this is just to show we know quite a lot about the psychology of quizzing. So, can you use multiple choice quizzes, or do people need to write short answers? Well, actually, multiple choice quizzes are pretty much as good as short answer quizzes. How many options should we use? Well, about 4 options tends to be about right, to sort of a trade-off between sensitivity and complexity. We kind of know a bit about how to design these sorts of things. The only downside here about quizzing is the risk of motivation loss. Students love doing quizzes the first couple of times. If you then, the next week, say, right, back to square one, let's do another quiz, there can be, the motivation drops off a little bit. So what you really want to do is to embed these quizzes in a structure that allows you to keep motivation high, which is where gamification comes from. So gamification, I suspect, so I was having a look at some of the other talks and presentations here, and I can see that the Bolton's starting to use bits of gamification, so Moodle badges, using the idea of play, that kind of thing. So, kind of gamification is making its way into higher education, although it's coming fairly slowly. Just to be clear about what it is, because it's a very easily confusable sort of concept. It's not about playing games in order to learn. That's another interesting and relevant sort of area. But this is about taking the elements that you find in games and putting them in a non-game context. So it can be, things like points, badges, and leaderboards, leveling up, that kind of thing. they're the game elements, but they don't necessarily need to be applied within games. And I'll give some examples about other places you could have them. You can also have, and I don't really deal with this as much, things like you have your avatar, you have yourself represented, you can have social interaction, social comparison. But all of this is the crucial thing compared to normal games. All of this has an external goal. It's not just about you completing the game. It's about you doing something else that these game elements motivate you to. So here are some examples from the real world. You can probably tell I'm not a great runner, but I don't know if anyone else has used the running app Zombies Run. Anyone is that not a big thing here? So Zombies Run is a great idea, it's a great concept, and actually it's probably the only thing that could encourage me to run at any point in the future. The idea is here, essentially it's a game of sorts where you're being attacked by zombies, as you'd expect, and you've got to build your base, you've got to upgrade your base, you've got to get resources in order to keep your base safe and protect the people in there. But you can only collect those resources by running. You have to run 2 kilometers to pick up these things, and so you have to run. You also have the sound, I think, of zombies chasing you in the background as you run, just to keep you going, which is quite a nice technique. So it's using these game elements of leveling up, of progression and that kind of thing. But actually, it doesn't care about the game. It cares about getting you to run. It's a fitness app. You've got the Swedish Hastighetslotteriet, which is the speed lottery, where essentially you've got this speedometer here, which tells you how fast you're driving. But uniquely, if you're driving below the speed limit, it uses automatic number plate recognition to enter you in a lottery for a prize. So keep to the speed limit, you can win a prize. Break the speed limit, you don't. And this was very successful. So it has the game elements of kind of getting in a sense of competition and a chance of winning. Reduced average speeds by I think about 5 kilometers per hour. You've got useful things like Fold It, which is a protein folding game, which is a lot more fun than it sounds, actually. Where essentially we don't know how proteins fold. We know their amino acid sequence, but we don't know how they fold up when they sort of come out. And actually, the human eye is quite a good way of looking at how they might fold together. So you've got to you're given a real protein, you've got to try and pull it together so that it goes into its lowest energy state. And you win points for getting into a lower energy state, because the lowest energy states tend to be the states that proteins end up in anyway. So it's been used, and you have teams from different universities competing and individuals, and it's been used to help find new protein structures that have been useful in seeing how they then interact with other biological components. And then last of all, and something that I really hope works, I'm going to try it, is Chore Wars, otherwise known as World of Chorecraft, which is a gamified way of getting people to do their chores around the house, essentially. So idea is, the whole family signs up for this this game, and you only progress in, I think it's a dungeon fantasy related thing, by doing your chores. So if you tidy your room, you get to level up and you get other resources and you can progress in the game. If you do the washing up, you get to battle an orc or something. It's great. So again, the testimonial suggests that it's incredibly motivating, particularly for children, but possibly also for certain types of dad. You progress. And again, it's using these game elements of progression levels and that kind of thing to get people to do non-game things. Now, we have to be a bit careful about this, because what we don't want to do is for people to just do the thing to get the reward. You don't want to crowd out intrinsic motivation. Students want to learn. People want to get fit, and if you start essentially paying people for doing it, do they lose their intrinsic motivation? And the moment you stop paying them, the moment they graduate or the moment they, get rid of the Zombies Run app or whatever, do they suddenly stop doing anything? Doesn't seem to be the case. So the research on motivation suggests that so long as you're not just routinely paying people for doing a repetitive task, you're actually rewarding them for doing well. You don't crowd out internal motivation. And I think that's particularly the case if you're supporting an existing goal. So students want to learn, people want to get fit. So this is a goal. So essentially this is just providing a crutch and a framework to help you achieve that goal. The other issue is social comparison. We tend to judge ourselves relative to others, and that's incredibly motivating. But no one likes a negative social comparison. So, you don't like to see you're right at the bottom of the leaderboard, or, you're way slower and much more likely to be eaten by zombies than other people, than your friends. So you've got to be really careful there, and that is as much an art as a science there. So I was lucky enough to work with the BBC for many years, kind of putting things on their website that gave people feedback on their performance. So looking at a way of presenting feedback that isn't always positive, because someone's got to be at the bottom, someone's got to not do well. And there are ways of framing it. So either you don't give people feedback if they're not doing, if they're doing terribly, or you give them feedback saying, you were better than 20% of the other players who've done this, which sounds a lot nicer than you were in the bottom 30% of people who did this. There are ways of framing it, and there are ways of sort of caveating it. So that needs to be done carefully, but it can be incredibly motivating if done well. So a reaction that I had when I first approached this, and one that you may have, is that this is all very well for running, but in education should be done for its own sake. We don't really want to bring this sort of gamification idea to the lecture theatre or to our schools or anything. But it's just to point out, for hundreds of years, we've had gamification in education. From primary school, we've had star charts, where you can accumulate stars, get a reward at the end if you accumulate enough stars, social comparison with other students who are gaining stars. The idea of house points, the idea of having houses in schools, which, I always thought was a sort of, a public school thing, but it seems, even our local primary school now has houses, and you can see why. It's a really effective way of motivating people. You then score house points for your house. You try and beat the other houses, and get your reward at the end of the year. It's all gamification. So my sons have, they use the dojo points in reception and above, which is just another way of awarding points for both behaviour and achievement, for effort, largely. And then even, kind of prizes for achievement and honour boards, and that kind of thing. That's gamification. That's sort of, that if that isn't a leaderboard, that happens to be engraved on wood, what is? So I'd argue very strongly that students are used to gamified learning. Increasingly now, students are used to a gamified world. Even websites have gamification. The BA website or LinkedIn have your profile is X% complete, which is a very, a very small piece of gamification. You think, but I want to get to 100%. I can see the circles round at 80%. I'm going to fill in some more of my profile. It's just these little nudges that use the sort of the understanding of game, the idea of wanting to complete to make progress. So we seem to have been a bit slow as a sector in use of gamification. The NMC, the New Media Consortium, predicts how things are going to develop in higher education. They thought this was going to come in the next couple of years. Because everyone's got smartphones now, they've got experience with social networks, and so on. It hasn't really made that much progress. It's starting to sort of get in now. A few examples from the literature, math achievement was one where you could do homework and level up in calculus and, and that kind of thing, gain points, earn badges. But the trouble with a lot of these things is it wasn't really integrated into the in-class sort of material. So there's this sort of self-standing thing that you could do separately, but kind of it was a little bit awkward sort of relating it to the lecture and the sort of the more traditional sort of learning experience. Social psych, you wouldn't be surprised to see that it's often psychology departments that try this sort of gamification stuff. This was a whole sort of learning environment where, students could message each other, they could complete gamified quizzes, move up ranks, that sort of thing. The problem there was it was quite hard work. There were barriers to sort of doing it, so not that many instructors or lecturers got into it, and so that put a sort of limit on what was done. A lovely example, the OU's Open Tree, because particularly with distance learning, keeping motivation up is a challenge. So this was a library resource where you could earn badges for helping other people, for accumulating resources, for looking up various library resources, doing searches, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, because of funding, it's literally closing down this month, I think. But a lovely example of, that sort of using gamified elements. So you can kind of hopefully see where I'm coming from in this project that I've been doing. I wanted to take something that enhances learning, so that would involve retrieval practice, etc. That had low resource requirements, so it could slot into lectures and is scalable. It's not, not needing one-to-one feedback or whatever. And that's motivating and useful for students, so it has these sort of gamified elements and allows sort of comparison and competition. So far, touch wood, it's been very successful. So we've had a few iterations of this. So, we've had a development round and then testing and then another development round. We're just about to do a final development. So if you have any ideas, do shout. So we've done a few different sort of surveys, and in all of them, between 90 and 100% of students who responded have said they like it, and a similar number say they think the quizzes help with their learning. Crucially, very few people say that they find it patronising, and this is a worry. You think you're teaching adults. I've used this on an MSc in behavioural economics, so I've got students coming in from senior positions in banks coming here. They don't find it patronising either. In fact, they seem to like it more. They like the competition element more than anyone, I think. But being careful to present it, as this is a learning tool. It's based in science. We've sort of validated. We're doing this to help you learn, and of course, if you don't want to do it, that's completely fine. But actually, based on the sort of written evaluations, the students generally only give positive responses, saying, yeah, well, we like a bit of healthy competition. It's good to consolidate learning. They're psychology students, so they know about this. But we've tested it in health sciences and epidemiology, using it in a sort of flipped classroom sort of thing. So essentially, you get students to read the material beforehand, run a quiz at the start of the lecture to check how much they understood or whether they bothered reading it. And then you can by looking at how well people did on the quiz and which questions they did well on and which questions they did badly on, you can then focus your resources and focus your time on the things that people needed to revise. Finally, just before I finish, because I know I'm running out of time, the other thing that I think is almost as exciting as sort of increasing student motivation is the way in which we get data, useful data that we can hopefully use to help students. So students, of course, get feedback on their performance. They get to see where they are on the leaderboard. But we also get feedback on how well the students are doing. So this is very informed. This is sort of subject to replication. We need to do it on a larger group. But essentially what I did was I just took the scores of the students who completed the first quiz on a social psychology module and looked at whether that predicted how well they did in the overall assessment. And it did, despite having technical problems, which meant that some people couldn't participate, which we've now fixed, touch wood, and various other things. We could predict both from whether they took part or not, because of course you've got to be there in order to take part, so it's an attendance measure as well. That sort of predicted how well they tended to do in the coursework, and the score that they got if they did participate predicted how well they did in the exam, which is more about sort of knowledge than participation. So we're going to use this across several modules on the first year psychology program to see whether we can. I don't think we'll be able to target specific individuals who we think may need help and support, but I think we can rule out 80% of the year going, yeah, they're attending and they're doing fine. So we can now try and work out among these other people who we're less sure about how well, who we should target and whether they need further support. So to conclude, we have a lot of challenges facing the sector, individually and institutionally. They often lead to this paradoxical need for innovation at the same time as we have a lack of time and resources for innovation. Technology can improve the efficiency or mitigate against the consequences of other efficiencies. So the idea being, if we have to use lectures, we can make them better with technology. And technology is developing all the time. You couldn't have done something like this 5 or 10 years ago. So taking the technology that we have and applying it in the ways that we know can be really useful, but it's not guaranteed to be either effective or popular. This is where our expertise as educators comes in. We sort of know what works. We've got a decent intuition about this. And I think my sort of take-home message for this is that as institutions, we have an amazing amount of experience and expertise. We've got people in psychology departments who know all about sort of learning motivation, but it's not just psychology. It's about user interface design, human-computer interaction. It's about all these different aspects of learning that can help inform the sort of teaching that we do. But we've also got hundreds, probably in this room, thousands of years of expertise in teaching, experience in teaching, and just being able to use that to help design either technologies or sort of learning activities, that sort of thing, to help understand both the constraints on educators now in higher education and the sorts of things that we think will work. I think overall, by being able to draw on our resources, as institutions, we can make the future of education, even with the constraints that we've got, very bright indeed. And on that note, I will leave it. Thank you for your attention.
I think that everyone's going to agree that that was a great keynote speech. Thank you for joining us, Professor Bolton. Questions? Please.
I asked a question yesterday. I'll ask somebody else first. Go ahead.
Oh no, please. You can. Yeah, please introduce yourself.
I'm Di Griffiths from the Education Department here. I'm also a long-time e-learning person, so I've been involved in a number of kinds of things that you're talking about. So I'm basically sympathetic to what you're doing. However, there's always
a but. Yeah.
Have you come across a book called The Iconocracy? Which, I mean, it doesn't matter. I'll say what it is.
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah, do.
It's a bunch of PhD students from Manchester critiquing the economics education which they've received.
Yeah.
So they're critiquing it in terms of the automatic acceptance of the concepts which they're being taught and the lack of any application of those concepts to a real world problem.
Yeah.
You know, and then saying, well, a lot of our problems in the economy are a result of this.
Absolutely. Yes.
Now,
yeah. I know the group.
Yeah. So I'm a bit concerned that some of these methods tend to reinforce the memorization of facts and the ability to operate methods such as the basic methods of economics 101, and tend not to support the critique and the application of those ideas to real world problems. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I have a problem with the methods, it's just the systemic effects of them on the education system. Can you comment?
Yes, absolutely, and they are issues that I have a lot of sympathy for. First of all, it varies by sector, you know, by area. So, you know, economics, psychology to a degree, certainly humanities is discursive, you know, critiquing. There is no sort of fact. You know, I studied natural sciences as an undergraduate, where there was a lot of this is factual and conceptual understanding. There's not really any debate about it. You know, we know how fast a ball will roll down a hill if you let it go, and you know, with zero friction and all these other sort of assumptions that you make. And you know, and so I think, you know, there's an argument to be made. There's certain areas where it works, but if you're sort of thinking about the general principle of quizzing, you know, and that sort of thing, there's some nice research showing how it can be used for really quite high-level abstract understanding. So depending on what you're teaching, you can absolutely quiz critiquing. You know, so you can certainly quiz the conceptual level thing. So I do a lot about the current replication crisis in social psychology, or in psychology in general, that actually a lot of what we thought was true isn't, and it doesn't seem to replicate in some of the issues. So you know, you can, you know, you are of course constrained, but you can, you know, I set questions on, you know, what's a potential criticism of this, or, you know, what are the sort of issues. Now, it's not as good as getting people to generate their own, because still you're giving them a sort of, you know, a fixed set of potential critiques, rather than asking them to generate their own. But as as one of a sort of an array of learning tools, I suppose it depends what your baseline is. If you're comparing it to just telling people facts, getting people to start thinking evaluatively, even if they're having to select something rather than come up with their own critiques, is the first step towards being an engaging, critiquing learner. So, and there is, you know, there's a body of research on multiple choice quizzing that suggests you can actually, you know, so we use it in our third year undergraduate assessments, because we're able to structure the questions in a way that requires more than just the learning of facts. It requires an application of concepts. We use it in some of our clinical things. So patient A comes along like this, and you have to come up with a diagnosis. So it's an application of what you've learnt, you know, out of context to a new context. So I think it's more flexible than it seems, but I think those critiques are sort of fair if that's all you were doing. You know, if you decided, right, we're only ever going to give students lectures and we're going to say it's okay because we're just giving them quizzes as well, then yeah, absolutely fair.
Thank you. Have time just for one question.
It's
Richard Nelson from Bradford College.
Hi.
Just want to support what you were saying and advocate what you were saying as well about one of the elements of gamification or game mechanics that I really advocate is the ability to fail in a safe environment.
Yeah.
That's what games are all about, really. Try as best as you can. You fail, all you do is drop back a level, or in the worst case scenario, you lose a virtual life. But that's what it's about, and they can work on that, the students, and build up their skills and development levels. And I can see how a quiz would allow that, in a sort of self-motivated way, in that you can see how well you're doing against others, and also see that I got the question wrong. But we're quite lucky at Bradford College. We don't necessarily have such large lectures. We have more close-knit group of learners to work with, and that's where we base a lot of our gamification on scenario-style learning. And the game mechanics really allows, if you think through carefully, for them to really try something out a little bit different. So if they do want to challenge what they're being told, they can.
Yeah.
In a way that safely will find out whether they're right or wrong, and then they can argue with the lecturer after that. But no, I think it's really good. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a nice
Okay.
observation.
Thank you very much, Stian. Thank you for joining us at the University of Bolton. Okay, thank you.
Colleagues, it's now time for basically have a break, and then the workshops are at 11 o'clock. We'll see you at lunch in the SLZ, and then we're back here for the keynote this afternoon, which is Professor David Kitchener. So enjoy the rest of your morning, colleagues. Thank you very much for being here, and to Stein and to Yanis. Thank you, colleagues.